Hi, good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Izuu Nwankwo, who is currently a research fellow at the Department of Anthropology and African Studies at Johannes Gutenberg University, Mainz in Germany, with his research interests in African diaspora popular culture. His present work is on taboo, self-censorship, and the limits of humor in African diaspora stand-up. His publications include Yabbing and Wording, the artistry of Nigerian stand-up comedy, Beyond Resistance, Humor and Politics in Africa, which he co-authored with Daniel Hammett and Laura Martin, and most recently, Stand-up Comedy in Africa, Human in Popular Languages and Media, which is an edited collection. Dr. Nwankwo will be speaking to us today on jokes about Africa and Africans in cross-cultural contexts. He contends that jokes concurrently produce humor and offense due to cultural differences in funniness and offense. He adds that with growing diversity in audiences and online dissemination of live events, stand-up comics have increasingly come under scrutiny for irreverent anecdotes. Punching up has become an acceptable form of benign transgression, more so in cross-cultural contexts where differences heighten offense. So a punch up or down is still a punch because jokes do not just make us laugh, but also discomfort us. His talk x-rays cross-cultural joke presentation mechanics, themes, and performer-audience relations in the acts of Andi Osho, British comedian born to Nigerian immigrants, and then Dave Davis, who is German and moved from Uganda as a child, Urzila Carlson, who moved to New Zealand from South Africa, and then Basket Mouth, a Nigerian comic who performs occasionally in the West. His talk also interrogates the performance specificities these jokesters enact to mitigate offense while dealing with sensitive and volatile subjects and a more diverse PC-conscious audience. Furthermore, he looks at the relationships between identity, cultural representation, and jokes. So without further ado, please take over, Izuu.
Oh, thank you so very much for having me. Thank you for introducing me and saying those wonderful things. Thank you. Okay, let me start by sharing the. Okay, can you all see that? Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm happy to be here. Let me know if you're not hearing me or seeing the screen with me.
We don't see the screen yet, Izuu. We can hear you, but we don't see the screen yet.
Now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So today I want to talk about jokes about Africa and Africans in cross-cultural contexts. And okay, so I'm timing myself. So I'd like to start by showing us the outline. I want to look at what intercultural encounters and their relationship or relationships to joking. And then I want to look at the many sides of what we can call African diaspora stand-up comedy. And then I'd like to look at jokes and some jokesters, some comedians themselves. But from the introduction, I was to talk about basket mouth, but at the point in preparing this presentation, I decided to replace basket mouth with Trevor Noah, whom I think a lot of us are familiar with. So without further ado, intercultural encounters, relationships to joking. So two things that stand out for me is that when we talk about intercultural encounters in present day existence, I'm talking about two spaces. The first one is the increased migration, which we've seen. We've seen a lot of Africans that have moved to the West in recent times. And then there's also the internet dissemination of performances. So I see these two sides as places where we have increased intercultural encounters. So increased intercultural encounters in these spaces mean that the delineations between what is jocularly permissible and offensive which before now depended on individual cultures and societies, have become blurred. So put differently, before now, what is humorous, or how humor is expressed, how humor is produced, and how it is consumed, the definitions of how these things happen are domiciled within individual communities. So when somebody from, let me see, so diaspora comedians perform in for mixed audiences, and then we have this internet dissemination. So I have a slide where I'd have to explain this. Now, this is what I mean. Now you have audience A, which is a specific community, and you have comedian A or comedians A. So which means these comedians are from this community. When performing for this community, these comedians are familiar with the limits of humor. They are familiar with things they can say, things they cannot say within this community. And they are able to say that comfortably and conveniently to this community. So it's easier for people in this community to understand what is being said, and there's no problem with that. And then we have also this kind of development where we find before now, where we find comedians B performing for audiences B and C, or communities B and C. Now, in this sense, you see that you find points of intersection, so it's easier for the comedians in this kind of setting to be able to understand, okay, we can learn what I cannot say in this community, even if they are not from that community. They're able to learn things they are supposed to say and things they're not supposed to say. But presently, what we have this, before now in traditional societies and communities. But presently, this is what we seem to have. Everybody is everywhere. With the internet, everybody is everywhere. And what the implication of this is that when you want to perform, if you are from a community A, and you want to, kind of characterize some jocular narratives in a particular place, you have to take the audience constitution into cognizance. And it becomes a problem because if you're not from the same community with these people, it's difficult for you to understand where the limits of where the permissibilities are. So in this kind of confusion, you find that people from different places congregate in a particular place. And even when they are not in a physical space, you find that internet dissemination also takes these things out. And at that point, you have a kind of extreme decontextualization. And when I talk of contextualization of jokes are funny within context. And when we talk of context, we are talking of the setting, the venue, the people that are in the audience. You're also talking about the identity of the performer. All these things are joke context. And there's something that's always neglected or ignored when you talk about the context of jokes. And that is preceding jokes. What I mean by that is in a set, what we call a set is when a comedian comes on stage, he or she tells series of jokes. And then there are some jokes that he or she puts before the other ones. Now, increasingly, comedians find ways to bring up jokes that are less funny or more offensive later on in the performance. And as they go on, they do this increasingly. As they do these things, the last joke, whether they should give a particular joke, depends on the response they get from the preceding ones. So in this sense, preceding jokes also form part of the context. Because if he or she has been able to establish a kind of mutual relationship with the audience, sometimes they are permitted in that setting to be able to say things that ordinarily would not have been found to be funny. And I'm tempted to use the example with the last slapping incidents we saw at the Oscars. And then you see in a lot of people who have made up their minds about whether they support Chris Rock or they support Will Smith didn't even take the time to watch the whole event, to see that there were far more offensive jokes that were given on that stage that night. And then when you look at the incident itself, you see that Will Smith actually laughed before his opinion about the joke changed. Now, we don't want to go into why his opinion changed and all those things there. So in this setting, Chris Rock built his joke or whatever it is on existing protocol, if we call it that. an understanding that he has established with this audience. But again, that turned out wrong. So this also highlights the fact that comedians always put themselves out there, put themselves on the line when they characterize these jokes. So my time is flying. So when we look at jokes, why is this a problem? The nature of jokes. The nature of jokes is disparagement. There are lots of ambiguities. It's transient. It's transient because they exist in the moment, ordinarily. But with internet dissemination, they are permanent. And when they are permanent, they are taken into different places, into different other contexts where they can become offensive. Then you have, it's confrontational. As I always say that stand-up comedy is one of, if not the most confrontational art form, because it's not only that you are dealing with, trying to balance humor and offense, you are also there. When a novelist writes something, the novelist is not there. They put some what do you call it? Some things they don't like or that people might find offensive. They put it in the mouth of different characters in their narrative. But the comedian is there. And even when the comedian makes up a story or says things he or she does not even agree with, because they're the ones saying it, they have to say it in a way that looks convincing for the audience. And that most times we think that's their personal opinion, even when they are not. So we can believe that the novelist makes up stories, but we hardly see the comedian as also making up stories in the same way. So that most of what they say is also fiction. Then suspension of offense. The comedian has to depend on the audience to suspend their right to offense. On the spot criticism, inversion of social order. So now why this is a problem is that first, the nature of jokes, the humor and offense divide. Somebody said the proximity between taboo and funniness is like the thin line that is said to be between love and hate. So it's a very thin line between humor and offense, because it is from the same means by which we are amused that we are also offended. It's the same means, it's the same route that both of them take. Now, the second part why this increased intercultural encounter is a problem is political correctness. There's increased the awareness of political correctness all over the world, unlike before. Before now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm saying the presence of political correctness also to a large extent limits the field the comedian can play in. And then we talk of increased sensitivities of offense. People are so sensitive these days that when you say even the slightest of things, it can cause problems in several places. And then decontextualization, this is something I've talked about. With internet dissemination, jokes are taken from the environment in which they are produced into other contexts where they become offensive. So now, before I talk about this, okay, I think before I talk about this, I also want to talk about the production of the definitions of what laughter could be or what humor could be. It is usually said that some groups or individuals do not have a sense of humor. This is a fallacy, because not just that everyone has the capacity to produce and consume humor, people also do this in accordance with their own histories and worldviews. And what this means is that you look at different societies. If you divide the globe into three, you have the West, the global North, you have Africa in the center, and you have the East, Far East, Japan, China, and all. Their responses to humor or the way they exhibit humor differ. In Africa, people can roll on the floor, laugh, and it's considered normal. In the West, you laugh in public out loudly. Sometimes people look at you as if you're not normal. And in the Far East, or in China, Japan, places like that, you see people who are applauding and they have straight face. None of these communities, some of these communities can be defined as having no sense of humor, but that's not true. Every society has its type of humor. So let's look at the multifariousness of African diaspora stand-up. Now, skin color. Africa is very diverse. You find, I'm trying not to use the word race here. So skin color, you have different kinds of people. There's always this assumption that in Africa, every African is black, but that's not true. We have so many kinds of Africans, and you find them also in stand-up comedy. We have ethnicity, we have Indians, we have Arabs, we have different people in Africa, different kinds of ethnicity in Africa, and all these people are represented in diaspora performances. Then we have nationality, people from different countries. There are 54 countries in Africa. And I know in the West, people consider Africa to be one whole country or one whole continent that people just move around, but there are 54 countries there. And then, excuse me, you have language. Now, when we talk of language, this is very deep because we have, apart from the indigenous languages, we have expressions in colonial languages, in Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone. So African diaspora stand-up also have people who play in these places. And sometimes we are more conversant with people who perform in English because we speak English. But French-speaking Africans also find people who are performing in France and other French-speaking places that we may not even know about. And then increasingly in the last few decades, we have also seen Africans who are performing in countries that do not have or had little or no colonial presence in Africa, like German, like Dutch, Scandinavian languages. And so we find Africans, and Italian also, we find Africans who are performing there. Then sexuality, we have people of the different sexual orientation who are performing, who are in African diaspora residents, where they live. We have them in North America, we have them in Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And then I just want to talk about this a little before I proceed to jokes, just to give us a background. Now, when we talk of diaspora, we have two broad types: the historical diaspora, which are people who were taken here during the slave trade, people who were taken to the West. Also, there were people who were taken to the East at that time, but we are more conversant with people that were taken to the West. And then when we talk of contemporary diaspora, we're referring to people who migrated during the colonial times and afterwards, like in the past, from the 1960s downward or thereabout. So that's the people I'm referring to, because the difference between historical and contemporary diaspora is that the contemporary diaspora has more experiential knowledge of Africa, because some of them were either born in the West to African parents who migrated themselves, or some of them were taken to the West by their parents when they were children, and some migrated as adults. And then we have people like basket mouths who visit occasionally to perform in these places. So humor is universal, but is largely dependent on permissiveness, as well as tacit acknowledgement of the limits of taboo and its violations within each cultural environment. It exists in every society, but the matter and manner of its evocation differ from one culture to another. So we have to understand that humor is everywhere. So with growing clamor for more liberal and progressive globalized society, there is no commensurate increase in jocular permissiveness. In fact, the reverse is the case. Given the uptake in censure and censorship owing to heightened sensitivities and consciousness of offense among different groups. So we find that increasing interculturality evokes confusion in terms of joking patterns and relationships, owing to disparities in delimitations of permissions and restrictions. So these delineations, which were hitherto more evident within individual, often more homogeneous communities, have become blurred, even inexistent in the subsisting regime of globalization. So in place of such clearly defined unwritten limits, the identity of the humorist has become central in recent times to how a joke is perceived and received. So we find comedians no longer speak to limited audiences with fixed liminal periods, but to all people for all times, due to the permanence and wide dissemination of new media platforms. Thus, they are constrained to invent newer ways of navigating the more diversified sensibilities and consciousness of offense that confront them. This prevalence of audience diversity and the accompanying complexities and ambivalences inherent in joke telling in present times have been described as shifting cognitions of offense in contemporary joke telling settings. That's how I describe this in a paper that's been published on Journal of African Cultural Studies. So stand-up art is presently one of Africa's most popular performances. It is widespread and has generated considerable intracontinental mobility. So we've seen movement along colonial language blocks, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, and even in North Africa, where Arabic is spoken. So, and due to perennial socioeconomic difficulties, Africans have voluntarily been on the move. So it's no longer about slave trade. People are moving to search for greener pastures in different places. So I have moved this fast because the time seems to be flying, so that I can speak about 4 jokes and see how we can just move over this. So I want to talk about Andi Osho. Andi Osho performs in the English language and builds her jokes around being Black, female, and British. She was born in the UK to Nigerian immigrant parents. She belongs to the first category of African diaspora comedians, those who were born outside the continent. She uses juxtapositions to draw parallels about experiences of being simultaneously British and African, and the complications that come with existing at the juncture of 2 national identities. Like most African diaspora comedians, Osho brings the insider-outsider look, allowing them to speak as natives of the West and Africa. So you find them having this kind of switch between being African and being British. And they do it with accents. She does that, she and people like her, like Gina Yashare and some of us, do that by switching their accents and also using local knowledge. So they use local knowledge about the British. So even though they look different from the majority of people who we know as Britons, we can see that by accent, she also emphasizes or kind of portrays her Britishness. So there's this joke, I won't be able to read this. There's this joke where she talked about a phone-in program she did when she was a child, or when she was younger, about 11. And she said in this phone-in, she called this radio presenter in the UK and gave her name. She was to win something, win a prize for calling or something, or for answering a question. And then she called in and gave her name as Yewande. And the man didn't even make an effort and said, I can't pronounce that. I'll just call you, and said, I will just call you Joe. And she said, okay. And after saying that, she now said, she transposes the situation and now say, if the reverse were to be the case, and this joke or this incident happens in Nigeria, a young British, an 11-year-old British boy calls into a radio program and gives his name as Charles. And the presenter will say, I cannot pronounce Charles, but I will call you Omar Farouk Abdulmutala. Now, the audience laughed. I know some of them may not have made the connection, or may not have been able to make the connection there. But Omar Farouk Abdulmutala, apart from being a very difficult name, even more difficult to pronounce than Charles, is the name of the somebody called Underwear Suicide Bomber, somebody of Nigerian origin who was in a US-bound plane in 2009 and unsuccessfully tried to detonate it, and he was arrested or overpowered by the passengers. And the connections here, okay, she used her knowledge of being British to also talk about things that the experiences they have. Now, the idea of mispronouncing her name and then not even making an effort to try to pronounce the name. And then she changes it and puts a different position where it happens in Africa, how people would feel. And then she makes connections with somebody, a well-known suicide bomber. So I've written down this, but I will just jump that and move to another one. But what I want us to note here is that in her case, she uses her Britishness and Africanness, if I'll call it that, to characterize some jokes. Now, the next person I want to talk about is Dave Davies. Dave Davies, now that's Dave Davies. Dave Davies was born in Germany. He performs in German, and but he has Ugandan origin. His parents, I think, fled Uganda at the rise of Idi Amin in the 70s, and he was born in Germany and he performs in German. So he's one of the few people who are here who perform in a different language other than English and French. Unlike Osho, Davies performs in a different language. He often reminds audiences that he's native to Cologne in Germany. Like Osho, Davies makes this assertion in order to counter the contradiction presented by his being ethnically different from people historically considered native to Germany. This is a comedy performance method as well as an effort aimed at normalizing the presence of people who look like him in sites they previously were not considered natives. Davis is versed in replicating German dialects within his narratives, and he deploys that expertise towards depicting people from different parts of Germany, aptly replicating their speech inflections, body mannerisms, and recognizable demeanor. So he's able to show characteristics of different Germans. If you are a visitor, you may not see these things, but being a native also here is able to see these things. And then at other times, he presents himself as an outsider, also looking into the German culture. And because he performs in this language, and he's able to use different dialects of the same language, he uses the native foreigner mix in conveying some of his critique of the society in which he lives. Now, the next person is Urzila Carlson. So Carlson was born in South Africa. She's South African. She moved from South Africa in 2006 to New Zealand, where she now performs and where she lives. And she calls herself lesbitarian. Lesbitarian, which means she's lesbian, and she identifies as a Presbyterian. So she makes the two and calls herself lesbitarian. So she leverages this conflation of sexuality and faith in her jokes as a form of underscoring her multiple personalities. Though she hardly makes joke characterizations about her religion, she does not shy away from speaking about her sexuality. Now, I want to say something about a joke that she performed, and she said, she came up and said, "Anybody from South Africa?" Nobody responded, or I think one person responded, and he said, "Be careful, because we steal." And when she said "we steal," that's offensive. But being South African herself, she can characterize that kind of joke. She can make that kind of statement because she is South African. And that's where the identity of the person making the joke matters. So she said that and then tried to explain it and tells a lot of stories. She said, "We South Africans steal." So in this way, she builds this narrative into stereotypes or Western stereotypes of some Africans. Now, if I go to Trevor Noah, who is the next person I want to talk about, it will be easier to understand this characterization that Carlson made. Carlson said, "We South Africans steal." But of course, we know or we believe that that stereotype is not for every South African. That stereotype can easily be, that stereotype can also be along ethnic lines, okay, in New Zealand. So when she said that, she was careful not to mention race. She was careful not to mention ethnicity. She simply said, "We steal." But when it comes to Trevor Noah, in his own characterization of those guys, he deploys his experiences and knowledge of the racist antics of South Africa's apartheid government in his jocular commentaries on race relations in the United States. So there are certain characterizations that Carlson cannot make, which Noah makes. So essentially, I want to conclude by saying that for the fact that joke telling does not often state its purpose explicitly, a doublespeak which counters, challenges, and even pulverizes stereotypes is always present. As such, it might appear that negative typecasts are being perpetrated by comedians of African origin, but it is important to note that jokesters mostly dwell on the underside and shortcomings of society. No one, nothing is spared. So due to the ambivalence of comedic ridicule, performers use several techniques to mitigate offense by consciously guiding audiences away from irritation towards laughter. There are 5 major strategies predicated on joking relationships, joke context. Okay, there are many ways that they make these. Let's see. Yeah, so these are the ways that some of these things are done. Okay, so liminality, joke relations and traditions of joking, taboos and boundaries, political correctness and sundry sensitivities. They make themselves aware of these limitations, and they're able to use joke patterns to circumvent or to navigate the problems of offensiveness. Now, their personality, their environment, as there are things that people who are dark-skinned can say, which people who are of other skin colors cannot say. They're like using the N-word. Somebody who is dark-skinned can use it, but when somebody else, who, especially a white person, uses it, it becomes a problem because of the historical associations to that. And then the environment and things I've talked about. Then language devices. In Africa, we have pidginized versions, which they also use play on words and specialized English or French or other languages that they use. And then you have personalized strategies which comedians use. Accents. I've mentioned it with Andi Osho, where she uses, this switch between accents. And then autobiographical stories. Comedians often make stories about themselves. Even when they are talking about somebody else, they always say, when I did this. So they make it look as if it happened to them. That is one of the greatest ways of circumventing or of trying to avoid offending the audience. Because if the story is about him or herself, or what they call self-denigration, if they make it about themselves, it becomes less offensive, supposedly, for other people. And then, so acting devices, embodied actions, and other things. So in essence, I'd like to close with this by saying that jokes are almost inherently ambiguous. There's always a double speak. And since a joke's sense is imprecise, the joke's meaning is indeterminate and open to possibility or possibilities. The joke foregrounds alternative perspectives, representing competing senses that yield laughter from the absurdity in juxtaposed circumstance. So the joke is there to make us laugh and also to remind us of our deficiencies and other things that are not good about us. Thank you so very much. I hope I was able to keep the time.
Thanks so much, Izuu. Yes, fantastic timing. And thank you for all the examples of the different comedians. It was fantastic to be able to, the theory you put behind it, to have so many examples of different comedians. That was very interesting for me, and especially our own Trevor Noah. We always enjoy hearing about him and works written on him. So I'm going to hand over to Andrea now to open up the floor for questions and discussions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jenna. And thanks, Izuu. That was very complex. I have 100 questions that I want to ask you, but I would, well, not questions, just comments and discussion points. But if there are, if any of the people in our audience, if you would like to chat to Izuu, raise a question, decide or a discussion point of some sort, then won't you please just indicate that on the chat? Or if you can't do that, then try find the hand up button. It'll be easier for me to kind of look at the chat session and then just say, look, I'd like to ask a question, and then I will open up the floor to you to actually speak to your question. So yeah, please feel free to indicate that on the chat. And in the meantime, while people are kind of gathering their thoughts together, one thing that kind of struck me very much was this, well, one of the many things was this idea of the idea that everyone has a sense of humor. So everyone's capable of humor, but is there a kind of universal humor? Are there things that all humans find funny, or is it always contextualized? And then if it's always contextualized, so that and then we are in a very much a globalized world, then do you have to limit your humor to things that would be fairly universal? Or do you have to be very, very, very careful in the stuff that you I think you've sort of answered that a little bit in your talk, but I'd love you to speak a little bit more to that, because it seems a very dangerous game to play, this humor thing.
Okay, thank you for that question. I always describe myself as an apologist for comedians because I know that it's a very difficult business they are involved in. In terms of universality, I don't think, that's my personal opinion. I don't think there's a universal humor. There's universal humor. I just know that laughter and humor is universal. But now the way it is produced, or the way it is consumed, and ways they are expressed differ. Not only in terms of community and groups, but also at individual levels. There are people who might find something funny, and people from the same community will not find something funny. It depends on our own individual experiences, I guess. But again, there's something that happens in stand-up situations, which is different from what happens with the internet. In stand-up situations, it's a group consumption of this production. And in that group, there's always this group effect where if most people find it funny, they suppress every form of dissent in that group. Now, but in internet dissemination, you find that when somebody is like, I'm seated with just my computer in this room and I'm watching a performance, I can make up my mind and then type a comment that I don't like this is not funny. Okay, but if it is shared with a group, the group can influence the decision of the individual in saying, okay, we understand this. I hope I'll be able to answer the question.
No, thanks. That's very interesting, isn't it? That your laughter response is often very much conditioned by the fact that other people around you are also laughing. Very much so. That's yes, interesting. Yeah. There's a question from Rachel. Rachel, would you like to sort of become visible and vocal and chat about your?
Yeah, that would be nice.
Oh, hi, now unmuted. Yeah, no, thank you very much. A lot of that I was really interested. But one thing that just jumped out to me, maybe from my personal experience, is like how sometimes there's this idea that some groups don't have a sense of humor, whether that's like woke people don't have a sense of humor, or like, this group of people don't have a sense of humor. And I guess it hits a nerve because there's something that was sometimes said to me in a work context, like, oh, you don't have a sense of humor, you're not, but I know that I love stand-up comedy, and I love certain forms of humor, and with my friends, humor is like one of the main ways that we connect. So yeah, just on a personal level, I've sort of experienced how sometimes it's easy to, when you challenge a joke or you don't find it funny, it's easy for people to say, oh, that's just because you don't have a sense of humor. So I just wondered if the same thing applies in a bigger context, like when groups are sort of characterized as overly serious or overly humorous. Like my aunt sent me this thing about like this therapy group for young people today, where they were all made to watch Friends and laugh at it. And some were like, I find this problematic. And the facilitator was like, shut up, so and so, or fuck off. Like she was like making fun of them for being overly offended by comedy. So there's also like so she was sending that to me, sort of like saying like, oh, your generation is like this, you find fault with everything, and like you don't have a sense of humor. So that's kind of interesting, because my generation absolutely does have a sense of humor. It's just different, maybe in some ways, or overlaps. Yeah. So yeah.
Okay, thank you for this. I think it also ties to the previous question that Andrea asked, because there's something I read. I think it's from Bakhtin, where he talked about. I'm not sure whether it's Bakhtin. It's all muddled up in my head. So, but the idea is that when mimicry starts, or when people start mimicking something, it's about, at the end of it's a way of showing that this is outdated. We are moving to a new form of expression. So mimicry and laughter and humor, or parody, or whichever one, when you make fun of something, you are showing that this is inadequate. Okay, so there could be alternatives. That's why it says it opens up opportunities, it opens up possibilities, newer ways of doing things. So when you critique something, because it's often a criticism, it's a way of saying that we are looking for alternatives or newer ways of doing something. So for me, it's not a matter of being right or wrong, okay? Because there's no way everybody can find the same thing funny. And there is no funniness or there's no humor that comes from something that we consider normal or something we consider to be regular. Humor often comes from those things we consider to be irregular, things that are not like us. There's always this superiority that comes with it in some humors, not every humor. So what I wanted to say about it is that when you talk about people having senses of humor or not having it, what happens is that the people who consider others, what we have is difference in the type of things that make us laugh or the things we find humorous. It's just differences. And that's where the problem of the comedian comes up, because he or she has to navigate these differences, find ways of getting through and making sure that this person laughs, but this other person doesn't get offended. Now, I'm preparing this because I want to say something that people don't find or don't agree with a lot. And that is that somebody said it in the conference we attended 3 years ago. And the person said it was about an American performer who was trolled for saying something to a woman in the audience in a live performance. And he fell out of favor with a lot of people. So this discussion was ongoing about this guy. And then he now made a statement and said, if you find something funny when it is about other people, then you somehow have lost the right to also become offended when it's about you. Now, what that means is that in several cases, we laugh when it's about when somebody else is disparaged. Because every form of humor I can think of comes from disparagement. Either it disparages something, somebody, or an institution. If you say, okay, that's why they talk about punching up. And they say when you are talking back to power, it's acceptable, it's permissive, you can permit that because you are talking back to power. So because you are historically disadvantaged, you are allowed to say these kind of things, to characterize these kind of things, okay? But it does not mean that those in power do not get offended by these things. So however you punch, whether it's up or down, it's offensive. So every form of humorous characterization, most forms, let me not say every, so I won't be doing a kind of overgeneralization, is offensive to a large extent. And this person said that if you find one thing funny, like when we go back to Will Smith and Chris Rock, Will Smith was laughing all night. And then when this joke came, he laughed. He laughed. If you go back, he laughed. And then he looked at his wife and then his expression changed before he took it. It was a delayed response. I'm not saying it is wrong. I'm not saying it's right, because jokes themselves don't give us the right or wrong thing. They just give us options and opportunities. So when somebody finds something funny, it doesn't mean the person is wrong. When the person finds it not funny, it doesn't mean that person is wrong also. That's how I want to describe it. So I don't, yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. Dr. Filani would like to ask a question, and then Glenn Holtzman. So let's just take Dr. Filani first, and then we'll come to you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Dr. Izuu. I hope you can see my face.
You can see your face, my Oga.
You are the Oga here. You are the one doing the lecture, and I have learned so much today. I asked the question whether you could see my face because I had initially played some kind of mask.
Yeah.
And the CV came up and it went off.
You had a black face.
I'm wondering, now, given this challenge we have with joking and humor, and I'm thinking, do we now say that we should censor jokes and comedians? And naturally, I will say no, but I think that sometimes we take jokes as if they are more than jokes. So, I mean, that is a challenge. I do not really subscribe to the idea of punching up or punching down, because when we bring those terminologies, we are trying to adduce more meanings to what the comedian does on the stage, as it were. So, and There's so many things that are running through my mind, but I think we should actually just summarize it with the idea that should we censor jokes? And each time again that let's go back to the examples you have given today. Let's imagine that, is it Chris Rock now? What's his name again that was slapped?
Chris Rock was slapped.
Yeah, Chris Rock. Let's imagine that was a white guy, not black. I do not think that the other guy's name, all right,
Will Smith.
Will Smith will be condemned in any way. All right, so somehow, although sociological studies have shown us that, okay, jokes kind of perpetuate biases and all of that, but I also think that, I don't know, let me leave it to you.
Well, I think that's a question, a comment, not a question, I guess. Or is it a question?
It's a question to you.
You're putting me on the spot. Well, I always answer it. I think I'll answer it the way I always answer it, and that is that jokes are there to give us possibilities and opportunities to look at things all over again. Sometimes you don't see something, and when that repetition, the idea of making you go through it again to take a look at it, it's sometimes about our own eccentricities. Some things, there are things we do as individuals which we do not even notice that we do. And then when our children, for instance, try to do the things we do, you begin to see yourself. Sometimes we don't even see ourselves in the things we do. So jokes have their uses, like every other thing we have in human existence. Jokes have their uses, and they also have their negativities. There are very bad things that come from jokes. I agree with you that sometimes they perpetuate stereotypes and things like that. But again, they have their uses. So do we now throw away jokes because of the bad things and neglect the good ones they do? The things that comedians say, novelists say worse. But because novelists put them in the mouth of different characters, they are somehow shielded. So comedians are actually berated because they are there, they are present, we see them, we believe that what they say is what they believe. Yeah, that's so it's not a right or wrong thing for me.
Thanks. No, that's important. It's also important to have a very, I think, interesting insight, something that I've learned, that you actually believe that the comedian is not telling a story, but is actually, sort of believes some of the things that she is pointing out. But okay, there are a whole lot of questions coming in, so and we'll probably start running out of time. So let's go move on to Glenn. I'm hoping Glenn will bring it back to Africa.
Hi, Andrea. Hi, Izuu. Yes, thanks.
Hi, Glenn.
I am actually interested, especially in your points which you raised about the African diaspora. I love that we've been exposed to looking at how Africans are using humor abroad, also outside of the continent. And my question relates to the idea that an African comedian who's Black specifically is allowed to toy with certain cultural issues on the continent, being Black and amongst the majority of Black people, even in African countries. But when these Africans in diaspora who are born, either born abroad or who have emigrated or gone over for working purposes, do these jokes in other countries, the Black African comedians especially are in the minority, whether it's Europe or in America. And I saw you had drawn on some of those case studies. And my question is, how does being in a minority seem to influence that intercultural playing field, which you spoke about, which sort of give birth to the idea of generating stereotypes, which could be exploited for humor? Because if they're not as privy to what's happening in the minority field of the African diaspora in those countries where the comedians are doing their stand-up sets, are they not perhaps losing a lot of the humor? Or is this comedian having to tailor their humor specifically to an audience, knowing that I'm in the minority, I can poke fun at the minority, but perhaps you can't? And so does the minority group then become a source of humor? This also extends to perhaps the question about sexuality and about the one case study you brought up about a lesbitarian. You see, the person who is a lesbian could now make fun about being a lesbian because that person is part of the minority group in society, but anybody else who's not perhaps would be frowned upon. So I'm interested in the idea of how do minority politics play into exploitations of stereotypes about race and being in diaspora or on the mainland, as they would say. Any thoughts about that?
Okay, I'll direct you perhaps to a performance by a Ugandan who lives in Canada. His name is Arthur Simeon. Arthur Simeon made a joke, or I think it's a whole set about what he called the African advantage. And I think that can answer your question to an extent. So if it's on YouTube, the African advantage by Arthur Simeon. Now, in that performance, he talks about African advantage. And what was he talking about? He said that somebody asked him why he uses the accent. He lives in Canada. He should be speaking like a Canadian. And that he's using the accent because it's an advantage. And he now used that to talk about other stereotypes, the advantages. And he said, perhaps Canada needs, what are we going to do with all these advantages? Perhaps we should start giving them as loans to other countries. So Canadians can come and take some of our African advantage. And he now started reeling out stereotypes about Africa. Hunger, animals roaming in the field, you know, those kind of stereotypes. The hungry children that they raise money for all the time, and all those kind of stereotypes. So it's not, I think it's not, sometimes we take jokes too seriously. So sometimes I think we take jokes too seriously. Jokes are jokes. They are performed in liminal moments. They are not supposed to be permanent. You know, the power of the microphone, what we call in Nigeria microphone anointing. You know, when somebody has a microphone, it's like an anointing. It's like the person is anointed and the person cannot even control what he or she is saying. Like I'm speaking now, I feel like I should talk for the next 30 minutes. Okay, it's microphone anointing. It comes on them. Now, imagine somebody who is a minority standing in the midst of a majority population, talking to them. You know, by characterizing these stereotypes, they are not trying to perpetuate them. They are trying to throw them in their faces. These are things you say about us. So see how it feels. And the example I gave about Osho, that's why Osho had to transpose the situation, our own experience, into a Nigerian context to explain, to show how hurtful those things can be. So sometimes people who use these stereotypes do not even know how hurtful they can be. And comedians throw it in their faces. It's like asking the questions, can comedy, can jokesters, can they affect change? Can they bring social change? They are jokesters. They are not activists per se. They are jokesters. And we take these things too seriously, I think. That's my opinion anyways, which may be wrong.
Thanks, that's a great answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Gary would like to ask a question, and then Nohaya too, which I will read because she's having internet troubles. But let's first get Gary up.
Yeah, hi, and thank you for that presentation. That is very fascinating. I was very interested in your usage of difference in there.
Okay.
And I've been trying hard to think of humor that isn't disparaging. The only thing I can think of is one of those joke boxes, you know, those things that laugh and then people laugh at the joke box. But I wondered if you could just, in terms of, is humor part of how we deal with difference? Is that a sort of coping mechanism that we build to make it easier for us to, you know, because difference creates this sort of anxiety within us, and is humor a way of sort of releasing that tension?
I would say yes, a resounding yes to that. I would say yes. I'll give an example with an area in Nigeria known as the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta region has a mix of different languages. So historically, there have been contests, you know, there's been quarrels among these tribes. And the interesting thing is that in Nigerian stand-up comedy presently, the highest number of comedians from any region comes from that Niger Delta region. They have a peculiar kind of pidgin English, which is very, In fact, I think it's the best form of pidgin English you can get because it's musical and it's sweet. And they use it in performances. And you hear them talking about Warri, the oil-rich city, and all those kind of things in their jokes. And in this area, comedy was a part of life even before stand-up comedy developed in Nigeria. And the reason is because comedy was used as a way of softening relationships, make it, it's a way of, because there's a Nigerian saying that says that the snail uses a good tongue to walk through thorns. The snail uses, because when it's sliding through the tree branches, it has to kind of salivate and make it smooth for it to go through. So, and that's the kind of thing that comedy does for us. We are too serious. That's the way I put it. It seems humanity is too serious, and that's why we find problem with everything. Everything is problematic. So I think I agree with you that humor is also a way that people use it to cope with difference. And it didn't start now. It has always been there. The rise of stand-up comedy in the US was also among minorities, the Jews, the Italians. They were mostly the comedians in the 1920s when the transition was made from minstrelsy to stand-up comedy itself. So it has always been a minority art, and I see it as a very strong post-colonial art form because you use it to poke fun at people you consider to be powerful, and they use it to cope with difference. I agree with you.
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you.
Good. One thing I just want to add on to there, I'm abusing my position, but I think it might take a very, very special kind of person to make that kind of humor work. Can you cultivate it? Can you actually cultivate an attitude of humor to help you work through kind of all the complexities and discomforts of being in a displaced position? If you're a diaspora, for one thing, but in a certain sense, everybody is displaced in some way. Can you cultivate a sense of humor, or is it a talent like an artist that can actually go through life in a way that is humorous?
Do you mean like as an individual, whether you can cultivate that? Or
yes, can I, as an ordinary person, cultivate an attitude of humor to help me negotiate the anxieties created by difference and other cultures and the cultural kind of clashes that are happening now? Or do we have to rely on stand-up?
If I answer that, well, I'm not a certified psychologist, but I think people find ways to, we are different. We cannot all be the same. Okay, there are people who sing, who are more serious, which doesn't mean they don't have a sense of humor. It's just that they have, they appreciate certain kinds of humor. Okay,
yes.
So that's the way. So we cannot all be the same. But what I've also noticed is that when somebody like Trevor Noah is performing, a lot of diaspora Africans are happy with his performance because they see him like he is saying it for us. He is doing things we cannot do. He's putting it to them, right? We see him as the person who stands there for us, speaking for all of us. And I think people also align with, there's this South African also, Noyi Sogola, who recently moved to the UK. He's also doing great work in diaspora community. And when you look at these guys performing, they say these things for us. And but as individuals, I think only psychologists can answer that very effectively.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully we'll have a psychologist or two later down the line, and we will pose that question again.
Yeah.
A quick question from Nohaya. Sorry, the chat is now going wild and I've lost my place, but here we go back. So she wants to know about the idea of liminality. She says, I'm interested in this idea and I wonder how you define liminality in the context of stand-up comedy.
Oh, I think the short version, the internet has helped us to do away with liminality. But if you understand it as that time where the inversion of social order is allowed, the period in which social order is reversed and it's allowed. You find it within festivals, within performances. I see stand-up comedy as that kind of thing. If the president of any country comes to a stand-up event, he sits in the front row. He or she sits in the front row and the comedian takes the microphone and becomes the most powerful person. Just like you see in festivals where the priest becomes the most important person in a place. So at the moment that the performance is going on, I see it as a liminal. It's something set out of the social order of time. So in that little period, most things that the comedian says are allowed within that period. So if somebody comes in the context of joking in that moment and says something offensive to somebody, some of the things comedians say on stage, if they leave the stage, especially when they engage with people in the audience, and they can look at somebody like Nigerian comedians can look at somebody and insult somebody in the audience, and everybody will laugh. If they leave the hall and make that kind of statement to the same person, they might get a Will Smith treatment. So that's So that's what I mean by liminality in this sense.
Very important. I'm afraid we've run out of time, which is really sorry. It always happens. We just feel like we're getting going, but we do have to be respectful of people's time. So I just want to quickly in the comments, Gary is saying that Charlie Chaplin and Mr. B could possibly be examples of non-disparaging humor. Not sure, they might be self-disparaging. So there's a thought. Yeah. And Vulindlela is saying TikTok is a haven for dark humor. Those are some thoughts to go away with or to carry on into our next seminar. And I'm afraid I can't announce what it is because I can't remember. But as with all of them, there's these really exciting and interesting peeps into the world of humor. It's a tiny little look in, hopefully by the end of our seminar, we will have had quite a few kind of peeps into different worlds of humor research. And I just want to say thank you, Izuu, for a very, very exciting, interesting, fascinating, look at humor. And over, Jenna, would you like to?
Yes, just thank you, Izuu, for taking the time. We know you're a very busy man, as you've indicated, writing 3 books in 3 years, no small feat there. Thank you very much. And we hope that you have time to join some of our next seminars coming up at this time every Friday. We'd love your feedback. We'd love your questions and what you could bring to the whole seminar as a whole. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so very much for having me. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hope to see you all soon and hope to see you next week. It actually will be Abigail Weiss or Visa. I'm sorry, pronunciations again. And Abigail will be talking about humor and emotion predominantly. So more on that next week. Okay, thank you and have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.